This was an interesting conversation. So this is between DILLON and I believe this is Andrew Schulz. Let me share my screen. And they had a conversation about capitalism. So let me go ahead and share. And I'm going to chime in between here because there's some things that are said about these cities in the United States that once were, I don't know, like these productive, thriving cities, and they just, over time fell apart. Now, I'm going to get into that in a little bit more. But Courtney posted this. If you guys don't know, Courtney's a part of the the ethnic women's liberation panel on this show. And Courtney said Tim Dillon is more left than Hassan Piker. So this should be interesting. So let me go ahead and mute myself.
Yeah. I remember when Detroit like fell.
None of us remember that.
Detroit.
You don't remember that.
You don't remember that?
You don't remember that. You remember Detroit fell?
Yeah, Detroit as a city like went bankrupt.
You don't remember this?
Yeah, I remember.
Where were you?
I was like in high school.
Yeah, it was Kwame Kilpatrick, right?
Yeah, it was like
the
it was
legend,
a pretty big story.
Yeah.
So,
the hooker.
But then Detroit been falling. RoboCop was Detroit.
Yeah,
that should have been on fire since the 80s.
Yeah, but that's the problem. Do you see what I mean? When you let American cities just completely disintegrate,
That is wild.
and there's like 5 cities where everyone has Lamborghinis, and then the rest of them are on fire.
Yeah,
that's a problem. And what happens is your country begins to decline, whether you can see it or feel it, because you're a millionaire and all your friends are millionaires. But the reality is, if you go to these other places where people don't have jobs, you don't have health care, they're totally fucked. They don't see a way out. Their kids are on fentanyl. Their daughter's on OnlyFans. This is part of now when those people.
But industry
have
changes
jobs,
certain cities,
okay,
man.
sure.
Okay, I'm going to chime in right here for a second. So Detroit is probably the perfect example that you can point to. When Professor Wolf was on here, we talked about Detroit. We talked about gentrification and what has happened to a lot of these cities that used to have a lot of factories, production. And part of this has to deal with the fact that we don't really make things in this country anymore. And what happened to those cities. So Detroit is probably the best example, but there are other cities that you can point to as well. And one of them is very, close to me on a personal level, and that's Baltimore. So my parents grew up in Baltimore. I was born there. I didn't really grow up there. Went to school there for probably a couple of months, 5th grade, and a couple of months in 3rd grade. So we're military, so we had to move around all the time. And my dad will tell you how he just watched like the city fall apart, how the city used to be when he was growing up, and what happened in the 80s. And a lot of you guys know that was the start of the war on drugs, and how drugs came into Baltimore City. Well, they haven't say they came in, they were put there. Let's be real, into Baltimore City. And then there was an epidemic. And he told me about how a lot of the factories that were in Baltimore, once they started to like close those factories and send those jobs elsewhere, well, then now you have people who had experience working in these factories and they were out of work. And if there were no other factories that they could go to work at, now you have all these people that are laid off, and you're having drugs come into the city. So obviously just not a good combination. But my dad would explain to me like how he feels about how Baltimore fell apart. And he was telling me that some of the neighborhoods now that people say are dangerous or are not safe to go to, he said it didn't used to be that way. And it really makes you think, like I said, a lot of people point to Detroit, but there are other cities that were thriving as well. Cleveland was another city many years ago, was thriving. I think I have to look this up, but if I remember correctly, I think I saw a documentary where they were talking about how one point Cleveland had the most Fortune 500 companies in the United States. So you have to ask yourself, what happened to a lot of these industrial cities, right? The factories closed, the jobs sent elsewhere. What happened to Detroit? It was the Motor City. Ford found a cheaper way to make those products overseas. You shut down the factories, the people lose their jobs. And so if there's no work in those areas, then you don't have people wanting to move to those cities because there's no work. And then if you don't have the work and you have people in despair, that also means it's going to be difficult for you to get people to come and teach in those cities too, because they're like, well, I don't want to move to that city. There's no other jobs there. I can be a teacher, but the crime rate's high and all this other stuff. So then the schools start to suffer. And then the schools become low performing schools, and then they shut down the schools. And Rome will actually tell you that. He said he watched them close 40 schools in Detroit. And it happens. So the point that Tim Dillon is trying to make here is that just because it's happening in a city that's not in the city that you live in, it still affects the entire country. We shouldn't just point at Detroit and say, well, that's their problem because I don't live there. It can have an effect on all of us, and it can spread. And that's what people don't understand. So when you tell people, when you have those kind of cities, like when they start to fall apart like that, what happens? The people with money leave. And they'll go somewhere else where they can gentrify another place. I see this happening all the time. I live in Boston area. It happens here it's been happening here for years. I've been here over 10 years. It's been happening here like over 10 years at least. So when the people with the money, when they take their money out, now the wealth is gone. And that's how a lot of these cities can just fall apart. It's really sad, but it happens. Sean M said there is no other jobs. The ironic thing of this is where the welfare queen narrative sort of got its start. They literally blame the victims of deindustrialization for its misery. Yeah, this is true. And like, it wasn't, I want to be clear about this. It really wasn't the residents' fault. You can't blame the people. The people that were just residents there and they liked working their jobs, like it's not like they came to those factories and said, shut down. They didn't tell them to make those things happen. They moved to those areas. There were a lot of people that migrated from the South. So the Great Migration, right? So a lot of people migrated from the South to those cities because there were a lot of jobs there. A lot of like industrial jobs. Then they shut those factories down. So now you got all these people here and now you have no work and drugs comes in. So it should be everybody's problem. All of us should be concerned about it, not just people that live in Detroit. So I'm gonna go back into the video.
This is American history. Industry is going to change cities. Is going to make certain cities more economically viable than others.
I understand that, but when you look at that working class, when they had jobs and could go on vacations, and they had money, and they weren't being completely replaced, and their jobs weren't being shipped overseas, you had a more robust country. You had a better feeling in the country.
Sections of the country. So those sections, Buffalo at one time, Rochester at one time were more robust.
Yeah, but don't you see that as a problem?
So is West Virginia.
But don't you think that's a problem?
No, I think that this just is the nature of changing an industry.
But that's
and I think I agree with Tim Dillon here. I think that is a problem. It is a problem. And see, Andrew, like he's just kind of looking at it as though, well, no, industries change and that's what. But it affects all of us, though. That's the thing. When you had like these auto industries like Ford just say, we're going to cut these jobs and we're going to send them overseas and we're going to get the parts from overseas because it's cheaper. So that's what we're going to do. Well, then that means that like you're not making auto parts here in the United States. So as a whole, how it affects the whole country, the United States is now relying on other countries for those parts. Now that may sound all fine and dandy until we go into some type of conflict with that country. Now they really kind of have us by the ropes. I mean, I'm sorry, but like that should have never happened. And it's unfortunate that people made those decisions. But that should have never happened. Imagine if we still kept if we still kept it that way here and those plants didn't close. Imagine what those cities would be like today. Imagine. But I do think it's a problem. I agree with Tim Dillon on this. And Andrew Schultz is just like, it's not his problem. See, again, this goes back to the class divide. He doesn't see it as an issue. As someone who's wealthy, he can just say, well, it sucks for that city, but I don't live there, so I don't have to worry about it. And that's something that Tim Dillon kind of points out when he says that, well, you're not thinking about it because you're hanging out with your millionaire friends. So it doesn't really bother you. And this is the class divide. And that's something I talk about often on this show. For people to just kind of just not care. It's different. Because I've noticed the same people who tell me that we shouldn't have healthcare for everybody in this country, they have healthcare. The people that tell me we shouldn't cancel student loan debt, a lot of times they didn't have any student loan debt. For people who are wealthy, these issues, it doesn't mean as much to them. Some of them may have some type of pity, but what I've learned over the years as I get older, a lot of times people care about the issues that directly affect them. If they are not directly affected, most of the time, they don't really care. I'm going to go back into the video.
For the arrogance that you're missing is going.
Miami is
it's hard to be arrogant when you live in a tent.
But
Yes,
if you
but here's
can
the thing.
see the rise and fall of cities, how do you not see the rise and fall of countries?
That's what I mean. Like, you don't think eventually this,
Like if the rise and fall of
becomes-
cities
No,
is
no.
natural and that's
Yeah.
evolution.
No, I understand what you're saying. I guess what I'm saying is it's not as if a new city isn't also going to pop up. So if Rochester and Buffalo Falls,
yeah,
Okay, in reference to what he said about a new city popping up, this is the problem with that. Most of the time, and I've seen this happen over the past couple of years, the new city that pops up because of gentrification. And then the people who grew up in those cities, they're pushed further out because they can't afford the rent there anymore. You look at some of these cities now that people are calling these trendy cities, especially like Boston. Boston wasn't always considered like this trendy kind of hip city. But over the past couple of years, because we have a large tech sector here, we're number 2 after Silicon Valley, by the way. We're number 2 in tech after Silicon Valley and startups. So now what you have is a city that used to be a working class city. That's what Boston was for people who don't know. It is now a city full of elites, academic, tech, and there's a lot of healthcare. A lot of people work in healthcare here. That's what Boston is now. The Boston that you see, I'm going to do a separate stream about this one day because you guys have asked me before to talk about Boston more. The Boston that you see when you watch movies like The Departed, no. When you watch movies like, what's another one? Oh, Mystic River. No. Those movies kind of represent the old Boston. Boston doesn't look like that today. South Boston doesn't look like that. I lived in South Boston. A lot of people think it's like, they're like, oh, South Boston is an Irish neighborhood. Not today. It's been gentrified. You can't go one block and not walk past a juice bar, a spin cycle gym, a taqueria, a Starbucks, a Pink Berry. You can't. So I just want to tell everybody that when you watch these movies, another one J-Dog just mentioned, Good Will Hunting, when you watch these movies about Boston, that is not what Boston is like today. It is very gentrified. I was actually surprised when I first moved here and I was like, oh, this is not what I thought it was. A lot of the working class people have been pushed out to the North Shore, South Shore, hell, all the way over to Worcester, to be honest. There are some people who commute over an hour and a half in because they can't afford it. So when he mentioned these new cities will pop up, yeah, but you're still, when these new cities pop up, it's a lot of times it's because of gentrification. So you're still dealing with the displacement of people. This is why I keep telling people capitalism is not working. It's not working. Yes, do I think it's okay for people to come to improve a community? Yeah, I think it's okay to improve a community, but you need to do so by not jacking up the rent prices and kicking the people who grew up in those communities out. That's not what they do. It's happening all over in these bigger cities, DC, Boston, New York. The last time I went to Brooklyn, I was like, what the heck is this? It does not look the same as it does when I lived there. Not at all. I felt like I walked into, I don't know. It's very strange. It's just very different now. And a lot of the culture is kind of diminished. And that's what happens sometimes when these cities become gentrified. A lot of the culture tends to go away because the people who create the culture are pushed out. But you got a Starbucks on every block. So those kind of cities, Austin is changing a lot now. San Francisco obviously is a big one you guys know about. So Portland, Oregon, Seattle, like if you talk to people who actually grew up in those cities before all the gentrification started taking place, talk to them sometime and ask them what it was like. There are people who will have realtors like knock on their doors and ask them if they can sell their house. That's a big one that's happening here, by the way. Some will say no, but some will say yes because they want the money. You know how much it costs to get a house in Somerville? Somerville is right next to Cambridge, right above Boston. These houses in Somerville going for like $1 million now. In Somerville, which used to be called Slummerville. There's no slum in Somerville anymore. It is no slumming, no. Same thing. Walk down the street, see a juice bar, a spin cycle gym. There's even like a pet boutique shop. That's what it looks like today. And so when he says like a new city will come up, I don't like hearing that because I just think about gentrification and what's going to happen to the people who grew up in those cities, in those communities, and actually made it what it was. Pretty soon, we're just going to have a bunch of generic looking cities. Everybody has these tiny box condo buildings. They all look the same. Everybody has a juice bar. Everybody has the spin cycle classes. At that point, you can live in any city, any one of them. They're all the same. It's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. All right, here we go.
Another place is probably going to pop up.
But it's bigger than just specific cities. These are entire industries. We have no manufacturing in the country, right?
This is a bigger problem.
We have no manufacturing. We don't make anything here.
Yeah.
Everything. So if you're an unskilled worker, you don't have any skills.
Yes.
You're competing against immigrants that come in all the time. You're competing.
So that was the part at the end that I kind of disagreed with. I wish we would stop calling people unskilled, like workers and stuff, because the thing is, a lot of times when you start at some of these jobs, they're going to train you anyway. It just is what it is. But the part where he said, like, you're competing against immigrants coming in, I don't really think that that's fair. I'm not one of these people that believes that immigrants are coming here and taking our jobs. From what I saw, especially when I waited tables, a lot of times when they did get jobs here, even in the restaurant industry, they weren't out on the floor with us. Like they weren't applying for like waitressing jobs. They weren't applying for like hostess jobs. They were, I hate to say it, but a lot of times they were in what we call the back of the house, which is the kitchen. So they would apply for like the cook positions, or they would apply for dishwasher like positions. Some people were paid under the table. That happens. And I think some of that had to do with there were language like barriers, but I don't agree that they're coming here and taking our jobs. I've never agreed with that part. But unfortunately, like that was the end of that video segment. I wish there was a little bit more. But I do agree, again, a lot of this at the end of the day, it just goes back to capitalism. And I've said this before, like it's never really worked for everyone. And just because one city is doing well today, that doesn't mean it's going to be doing well 10 years from now or 5 years from now. And then the next thing you know, like I said, when these cities fall, wealthy people who live in those cities, they take their money out of the city and they move somewhere else. This is similar to what happened with white flight, where white people left the cities and moved to the suburbs. So when they left the cities, the money that they had went with them. Hence why the property tax issue when you're funding public schools, this is why I'm against property taxes funding public schools, because obviously if you're living in the inner city, most people in Boston and New York cannot afford to own their home, right? Most people are renters. So obviously the property taxes are going to be low, which means the schools in those areas are going to be underfunded. But that's a whole nother discussion. I get passionate about education because something has to change. Pat said, if you fix the economics, you fix most of the social problems. I lived in Sweden in the early 89s, and with all the social programs and employment, crime was almost nil. No, you're right. You're right. Quaker! Speaking of healthcare, want to join a Medicare for All tweet storm this weekend and Monday? DM me at Quaker Socialist or reply to my tweet about Tweet Storm. Guys, definitely check out, I forget Quaker Socialist changed their name to Quaker Anarchist. Definitely follow Quaker Anarchist on Twitter, because Quakers are like awesome things, and she's in the Boston area with me. Definitely participate in that. We got to get people healthcare in this country, so we're gonna have to push as much as we can do. Ashura said, Sabby, are you for private schools? Roland S. Martin supports them, and Nina Turner. Of course Roland does. Boy, I tell you, that guy. So me personally, no, I do not. I'm not in favor of private schools. I think that we should have public schools for everybody, and the public schools should be on the same caliber regardless of your zip code. I think that that is something that I wish if I could change with the public education system. All of these kids need to be given a decent education. It should not be based on the fact that you live in an area, the property taxes, where the property taxes are in your area, because basically you are penalizing kids that are poor. You're basically telling them that since they're poor, they don't get to have a decent education. And that's really fucked up when you think about it. What a crappy, boy, I tell you, this country, oh man, this country. But no, like these private schools, it just, why can't you take a private school education and give it to all the public schools? Why? It's not fair. It's really not fair that because someone's rich, they get to have a better education. That's really screwed when you think about it. That's the mentality of that. This is why I tell people that a lot of times when they bring up Brown versus Board of Education, when it comes to the public school system, we're really not that far removed from Brown versus Board of Education. Now, yes, it fixed the segregation issue in reference to law. So schools were no longer lawfully segregated, but they're still segregated. And the Black schools are still underfunded for the most part. So that's why I tell people we're still not far removed from Brown versus Board of Education. And if you worked in some of these school systems, you would see the difference. I can go 15 minutes down the road in Boston and go to one school that is closer to the Newton-Boston borderline. And then I can go the other direction 15 minutes down the road and go to a school that is closer to the Alston, I guess, Brighton borderline, and you'll see the difference. 15 minutes down the street. Different zip code, though. See? Leroy said the mentality of charging for school is rooted from slavery. That's well said, Leroy. Well said. Yeah, it's absolutely disturbing, actually. Like, I don't understand why more people are not outraged by that. Delthea Simmons said labor is connected to place. Capital knows no borders. We need to get to make people free and money contained. Janice said no such thing as unskilled work. Every position requires skills. Service positions like cashier, waitstaff, busboy, retail sales, etc. require the ability to multitask and provide customer service. And that is why those jobs can be incredibly difficult, to be honest with you. Like waiting tables is not easy. Any of you in the chat ever worked in the restaurant industry before? Waiting tables is not, You have to be able to turn your tables quickly so that you can get tips the way that you want. If you get tipped, let's just be real. You have to be able to turn those tables fast. You have to carry those heavy trays of food. Like sometimes I get home from work at night, and my back would hurt so bad just from carrying like those trays are heavy, those heavy trays. So you have to have some muscle. You have to be able to lift those. A lot of times you're there late, especially if you have to close. It's hard work. And if you're a hostess, forget it, because I've seen the way some of the customers can just be so nasty towards the hostess if they're not seated where they want to seat. It's hard work. It is hard work. Yes, and Eric is right. Oh, and by the way, you better smile while you're doing it. If you want those tips, you got to smile. Justin said is a former line cook. So Justin, you know about back of house. You know about BOH. If anybody worked in restaurant industry, we have some of these terms that we used to use. Like one was in the weeds, and I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, but like in the weeds is when like you're so overwhelmed that you need someone to help you out. And sometimes that'll happen if you're triple sat. And I've been triple sat multiple times before when I waited tables. And that's hard because you really got to bounce to each table within a certain time limit, get to the back, put all the drink orders in, bring out all the drinks, go right back to the kitchen, put in all the food orders. God forbid someone gets an appetizer. It's something. It's something. Thanks for the super chat, Delthea Simmons. Ignorance and want are how the elite bind the masses. Thank you so much for the super chat. That is true. That is very true.